r/ProRevenge. Dad gets fired for BS reasons, plays the long game, ends up in charge, takes the extended family on a cruise. Story by Dromio05. Enjoy! My dad had worked at the same company for almost 30 years before he was abruptly fired for complete bullshit. He was coordinating an upcoming meeting of people who had to fly in from around the country. One important participant resigned unexpectedly, so Dad cancelled the meeting via email and explained why. Apparently that counted as improperly communicating privileged information, and he was fired the next day. All this happened a week after Dad's boss retired and was replaced by a new guy who wanted to cut costs. What a coincidence. This was about 10 years ago, near the height of the recession. Dad was in his 50s, hadn't interviewed for a job since the early 1980s. He wasn't sure he'd ever find another job. My mom went back to work at a school to pay the bills, while Dad scraped together what he could doing some shit-tie online consulting gigs for basically minimum wage. They managed to keep their heads above water, but only barely. Dad was out of work for a year and a half. He finally landed a job at a new company 3 states away, coincidentally about an hour away from where my wife and I lived and were expecting Dad's first grandchild. Mom and Dad moved to live about 20 minutes away from us. They had paid off the mortgage on their house, so they decided to keep it and rent it out, planning to retire there in a few years. New company treated Dad very well. Better salary than he'd made at old company, good benefits, and respect from his coworkers and superiors. A year later, Mom and Dad were able to buy a second, smaller house near their grandkids. Dad mentioned a few things about his time at old company to his new bosses. Nothing confidential or anything, more like overall strengths and weaknesses. Of course, the story of how he got fired came out as well. It turns out that when you work at a company for over 25 years you learn a thing or two about how it works, and cutting costs by firing experienced employees can make your company vulnerable. New companies started to get very interested. They saw an important business opportunity, and also a chance to get revenge on behalf of a valued employee. A couple years later, new company bought old company. They were both big companies, and mergers of this size take time, but when the dust settled it was clear there were redundancies, divisions and products that both companies had that new company only needed one of. They kept as many of old company's people as they could, and very few lost their jobs. Except, of course, for the people responsible for firing Dad. New company put Dad in charge of the building he used to work in at old company and let him choose his employees from both old and new companies. Dad had to move back to the old state, so new company helped sell his house in the new state and gave him a moving stipend of several $1,000s. But Mom and Dad were just moving back into their own house. They sold their new house that they'd made payments and improvements on for 5 years for a nice profit. With that money plus the moving stipend, they paid off debts, saved for retirement, and took me, my siblings, our spouses, and the grandkids on a cruise. Edit. Since people are asking, I never heard exactly what transpired when the guy who fired Dad got downsized. But, since it's Christmas, I'm actually able to just ask him. Dad wouldn't say. Exit interviews are supposed to stay private. I told him about this post, with all the names left out, and that people wanted to know. He just grinned and said, that would be improperly communicating privileged information. r/ProRevenge. You won't pay rent? Good luck finding a new apartment. Story by Drumhedd. Enjoy! So this happened to me about 10 years ago in a big city on the West Coast. Hopefully this counts as pro-revenge. I had just finished grad school and was looking for a way to cut down on rent in an already expensive rental market. Now, mind you, I was young, desperate, and inexperienced with roommates at the time, and this was a huge life lesson for me and hopefully for my roommate too. I placed an ad for a roommate on Craigslist, which in hindsight wasn't a smart move. Enter bad roommate. Bad roommate was a few years older than me and at first seemed really cool with a stable job as a licensed masseuse. After interviewing her, hitting it off really well and getting to know each other for about a month, we rented a loft in downtown around October with the agreement rent, utilities would be split. Around the time our first rent was due, November, bad roommate said that her work had been slow and she would pay rent in the next 2 weeks. Luckily I had enough in savings so I covered rent. Well, the 2 weeks came and went and still no rent. When I asked her about the rent, she yelled obscenities and accused me of being abusive and harassing her. No kidding. While claiming she didn't have money for rent. She would be out of the house from around 9 a.m. until around 2 a.m. visiting friends. All of this nonsense continued on, as well as other things such as stealing my food and breaking some of my belongings, including a bottle of wine that my recently deceased sister had gifted to me. Bad roommate's excuse was bad energy in the house, while giving me a little smirk. Fast forward to the beginning of December and you guessed it, still no rent. This time, in addition to yelling obscenities, accusing me of being abusive, and breaking my stuff, bad roommate called the police on me, accusing me of making threats. The cops did not do anything as there was no evidence I did anything. For the record, I didn't, but they did give me a lecture about making threats and said next time they come out I could be arrested or forced to leave the residence. By this time I was almost out of savings and was fearing eviction. Bad roommate had not paid rent since move-in. The final straw came when I came home from work to find her threatening my 2 cats who were cowering in the corner. I almost lost it, but due to what happened before with the police I didn't want to poke the fire. This is when I remembered the officer saying I could be forced to leave the residence, and a light bulb went off in my head. Now the revenge part. I called my best friend whose father, best friend's dad, attorney, was an attorney. After a phone consultation with him, he told me to pay up the rent and utilities through December and then simply surrender my key, garage remote, etc. with a signed note saying that I surrender possession of the property with a specified date. I snapped a photo of this note and left it with the secretary in the management office. I then proceeded to sign a new lease with the last of my savings. 1 week before Christmas, while bad roommate was out visiting friends, I packed up all of my belongings and left the house pretty much empty except for the little bit of belongings she had, a little bit of food in her bed. After about 2 days of angry voicemails, texts, and missed calls from bad roommate telling me what a horrible and irresponsible person I was to do this. Boom. Dead silence until April. In April I was served with a summons for breach of contract for abandoning the lease by the landlord. I contacted the attorney, aka best friend's dad, and filed a response to the court with a hearing date set in late May. I showed up to the hearing with my friend's dad, attorney, and his 2. I'm guessing they were assistants. Bad roommate was also there looking smug, think wine bottle incident smirk. Next thing I know, the other attorney announces they are dismissing me from the lawsuit since I surrendered possession of the property, but they were not dismissing it against bad roommate. Bad roommate's face went gaunt, the smirk disappeared, and it was priceless. After some back and forth with her almost getting held in contempt of court for outbursts, the judge ruled against my roommate with full judgment awarded to the landlord. The first cherry on top? Best friend's dad represented me pro bono. The final cherry on top? I came to find out a month later via an angry voicemail from bad roommate that after being kicked out of a friend's house while couch surfing, her credit was trashed. She had an eviction on her record, and subsequently could not get another apartment, and that again I was a horrible irresponsible person. I never heard from her again afterwards, but she was on the news a few months later, mugshot and all, for trashing a convenience store. Last I heard she moved to Las Vegas. In the end my credit did take a small hit. Even though the suit was dismissed, the debt was put into collections and reported to the credit bureau. For the next 4 years I tried unsuccessfully to have it removed. At the 4-year anniversary of the lawsuit, I petitioned the credit bureau under the advice of my friend's dad, attorney, to clear my record as the statute for filing suit had expired at the 4-year mark. Failure to comply with the request would result in a lawsuit against the credit bureau for slander of credit. To be honest, I just followed his instructions, not knowing what I was even talking about. A couple days later I received a call that my record had been cleared. Long story, but in the end it was worth it to get back at an otherwise horrible person. You are an absolute legend for making it to the end. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please hit that like button. And if you can't get enough, consider subscribing. See you around.